The last thing Nurse Grace Whitmore expected to see at the end of her final shift was a line of armed men standing silently at the end of the hospital corridor. She had already removed her badge, packed the last of her belongings into a worn black bag, and told herself she would never walk through those hospital doors again. After 12 years of night shifts, missed holidays, cold coffee, and quietly carrying other people's pain, Grace had finally decided she was done. But when the elevator doors opened and 4 men in Navy SEAL gear stepped into the corridor, the entire hospital seemed to hold its breath. They weren't looking for a doctor. They weren't looking for an administrator. They were looking directly at Grace. Then the tallest man stopped several feet away, straightened his shoulders, and addressed her with a word that made every nurse at the station turn around. "Ma'am, if you believe that kindness can change a life, that people sometimes deserve a second chance, and that the quietest heroes can carry the biggest stories, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel." Because Grace's story was about to reveal why those men had come. Grace had worked at Mercy Ridge Medical Center in Virginia for most of her adult life. She wasn't the nurse who demanded attention. She didn't post inspirational quotes on social media or tell everyone about the good things she did. She simply showed up. During hurricanes, she showed up. During Christmas mornings, she showed up. When other nurses called out sick, she stayed late. When frightened families couldn't understand what a doctor was telling them, Grace sat beside them and explained everything patiently. Her supervisor, Patricia Coleman, used to say Grace had an unusual gift. She could make a person feel safe without saying much at all. But after years of working nights, that gift had begun to cost her more than anyone knew. 6 months earlier, Grace had lost her husband, Nathan, to a sudden heart condition. Their daughter, Abigail, was away at college, and Grace had thrown herself into work because the empty house waiting for her after every shift felt unbearable. She told everyone she was fine. She wasn't. She was exhausted, grieving, and increasingly invisible. Then one terrible night, everything changed. A wounded military officer was rushed into the emergency department after a training accident. The doctors were overwhelmed, the corridors were crowded, and his vital signs were collapsing. Grace noticed something no one else had caught. The medication prepared for him didn't match the notes attached to his transfer papers. She stopped the administration and demanded the chart be checked. Minutes later, the medical team discovered a potentially catastrophic error. The patient survived. Grace expected someone to thank her. Instead, the hospital administration opened an investigation into why she had interfered with the physician's orders without authorization. The official explanation was that Grace had violated protocol. The unofficial reason was even simpler. She had embarrassed someone important. Her warnings about staffing shortages and unsafe night shift conditions had already made administrators uncomfortable. Now they had a reason to remove her. She was told her position was being eliminated and that she should finish her final shift quietly. So Grace did exactly that. On her final night, she moved through the hospital as if she were saying goodbye to a home. She checked on an elderly patient named Harold who always pretended he didn't need help. She adjusted the blanket of a frightened teenager named Caleb. She brought water to a janitor named Thomas who had been working since sunset. None of them knew it was her last shift. When a young nurse named Rachel asked Grace why she looked sad, Grace simply smiled and said she was tired. At 6:42 the next morning, Grace entered the locker room, changed out of her scrubs, and placed her hospital badge on the bench. She stared at it for several seconds. 12 years reduced to one plastic card. Then she picked up her black bag and walked toward the exit. That was when the elevator doors opened. 4 men in military uniforms stepped out. The hospital corridor went strangely quiet. Their uniforms were unmistakable, their movements controlled, and their expressions serious. One of them carried a folded American flag under his arm. Another held a small sealed case. Grace stopped walking. The tallest man approached her. Grace instinctively looked behind herself, wondering if someone else was standing there. There wasn't. The man stopped and said, "Ma'am, we need to speak with you." Grace's heart began pounding. She recognized him, not personally but from the night of the accident. He had been one of the men who arrived with the wounded officer. She remembered his blood-stained uniform and the way he had refused to leave the emergency department until he knew his teammate would survive. Grace quietly asked why they were there. The man looked at the other SEALs, then back at her. He told her that the officer she had saved wasn't just another patient. He was the commander of their special operations unit, and Grace's decision that night had saved his life. But that wasn't the reason they had come. The reason was what happened after the officer recovered. He had learned that Grace was being fired. He had asked why. When he was told that she had violated protocol, he demanded to see the records. And when he did, he discovered something the hospital administration had hoped no one would notice. Grace hadn't violated protocol. She had followed the emergency medication safety standard precisely. The paperwork had been altered after the incident. The investigation had been built around a false report. The SEALs had spent weeks gathering documentation because their commander believed the nurse who saved his life was being punished for doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Grace stood frozen. She had spent months believing she wasn't good enough anymore. She had wondered whether grief had made her careless, whether she had become too old-fashioned, too stubborn, too willing to question people above her. Now 4 highly trained military operators were standing in front of her because she had refused to ignore a mistake. The tallest SEAL opened the small case. Inside was a simple folded flag and a handwritten letter. He explained that their commander wanted Grace to know something before she left the hospital. He said that during his recovery, he had asked his team who had stayed with him when everyone else was rushing around. They told him about the nurse who had checked his medication twice, held pressure against his wound, and refused to let anyone dismiss the warning signs. Then the commander had said something that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. He said that people often imagined heroes as soldiers carrying weapons into danger, but sometimes heroes were the people standing under fluorescent lights at 3 in the morning, making one careful decision while everyone else was too exhausted to notice. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She tried to thank them, but her voice broke. One of the younger SEALs quietly told her that she didn't need to thank them. They were there because she had done something for their family. That word hit her harder than anything else. Family. For years Grace had believed she was simply an employee. Replaceable. Forgotten. A name on a schedule. But to the men standing before her, she was something different. She was the nurse who had protected one of their own. The SEAL commander then handed her an envelope. Inside was a formal letter from the unit's leadership, recognizing her actions and documenting the circumstances surrounding the medical incident. It wasn't enough to erase every painful thing that had happened, but it was proof that the truth had finally caught up with the lie. Then something unexpected happened. The 4 SEALs stood together, and they saluted her. Grace immediately shook her head, overwhelmed, whispering that she hadn't done anything extraordinary. The tallest man lowered his hand and said that was exactly what made it extraordinary. She had done the right thing when nobody was watching. Behind Grace, nurses had gathered near the station. Patricia, her former supervisor, stood among them with tears in her eyes. The hospital administrator who had signed Grace's termination letter had arrived moments earlier and looked completely stunned. But Grace didn't turn around. She didn't need an apology. She didn't need revenge. She simply looked at the 4 men who had come to find her and finally allowed herself to cry. That morning, Grace didn't walk out of Mercy Ridge feeling like a fired nurse. She walked out knowing that her 12 years had mattered. Weeks later, the hospital formally corrected her employment record and offered her position back. Grace accepted, but only after negotiating stronger patient safety protections for night shift nurses. She didn't return because she needed the hospital to prove her worth. She returned because she wanted the next exhausted nurse to have the courage to speak up without fear. And every few months, a letter arrived from the military unit. Sometimes it was only a few lines. Sometimes it included a photograph. But the final letter Grace received carried a sentence she kept beside her husband's photograph at home. It said, "You protected one of ours when he couldn't protect himself. We will never forget you." Grace finally understood something she had forgotten during her darkest months. A person doesn't have to be famous to matter. They don't have to be powerful to be remembered. Sometimes the greatest impact comes from simply refusing to look away when someone needs help. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes that good people still exist, and subscribe for more stories about courage, kindness, and unexpected second chances. And before the story ends, I want you to leave one special comment. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Let that be your reminder that somewhere today, an ordinary person may be doing something extraordinary without anyone noticing. Grace's final shift was supposed to be the end of her nursing career. Instead, it became the beginning of something she never expected. Because sometimes, just when you think the world has forgotten what you did, someone walks through the door to remind you that your kindness mattered. And sometimes, the people who arrive to say, "Thank you," have traveled a very long way simply to make sure you know one truth.